Good day, everyone. My name is Trisha Sanihon, and I am here today to present my thesis, ASEAN Women Cultural Workers in the Film and Theater Industry and Their Role in Addressing the Negative Societal Impacts of Traumatic Historic Events, the Case of Cambodia and Indonesia. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the presence of my advisor, Dr. Caroline Sobrichea, members of my thesis committee, Dr. Grace Javier Alfonso and Dr. Maria Cecilia Medina, and ASEAN Studies Program Chair, Dr. Jean Saludades. A brief background and rationale of the study. Southeast Asia has been the site of a number of instances of political violence in its history. In the latter half of the 20th century, the region has been beset with conflicts due to the interplay of the Cold War and the continuing indigenous independence movements against Western imperialism. It is in this context that two instances of the worst mass killings in the region occurred: the Indonesian Anti-Communist Purge from 1965 to 66 and the Khmer Rouge genocide from 1975 to 79. These events of mass killings and atrocities have caused disruptions and major ruptures in social relationships. Furthermore, there has been a limited focus on gendered violence during these genocidal events. Even with the efforts of the International People's Tribunal and the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, justice has been elusive for most of the women survivors in Indonesia and Cambodia. The focus of my study will be on the ASEAN women cultural workers and their role in addressing negative societal impacts in Indonesia and Cambodia. Why cultural workers? Cultural workers produce texts that can provide an avenue for deconstructing the history of political violence, which more often than not leaves out the voices of the victims. Why women? According to Claudia Card, women play a central role in preserving and passing on the traditions, languages, and daily practices from one generation to the next, and in maintaining family and community relationships. Why women's stories? According to Dirgantoro and Hatley, women's stories highlight the role of women in sustaining family life practically, economically, as well as emotionally, which played a key role in them overcoming their pain, maintaining resilience, and surviving through their experience of gendered violence. As this study focuses on the effects of the political instabilities on women, it would make sense to examine the works of ASEAN women cultural workers, works by women, about women, and for women. There have been limited works that tackle the subject of the role ASEAN women cultural workers play in addressing negative societal impacts of mass killings and atrocities through women's stories. In my review of literature, there are two articles that tackle this subject: Ulan Dirgantoro and Barbara Hadley's Memory on Stage, Affect, Gender, and the Performative in 1965 to 66 Survivor Testimonies, and Raya Morag's The New Post-Khmer Rouge Women's Cinema, The Horrific Intimacy of Auto-Genocide and the Ethics of Unforgiveness. Dirgantoro and Hatley's article is an analysis of the artistic strategies and experiential impact of two Indonesian plays that tackle the subject of 1965 to 1966 anti-communist purge, directly and indirectly, the silent song of the Genjur flowers, and turmoil at the sacred grove. Morag's article, on the other hand, is an analysis of two films by second-generation women filmmakers that explore the spectrum of post-genocide ethics of forgiveness, from unforgiveness to operatic reconciliation, The Last Reel and Angkar. Dirgantoro and Hatley drew from Marian Hirsch's concept of post-memory for their analysis of the two Indonesian plays and came to the conclusion that these performances sought to empower the women survivors and open up the space for empathy from the audience for their plight. Morag drew from Jacques Derrida's Unforgiveness and Claudia Card's concept of social death as the central evil to genocide in her analysis of the two works by Khmer women filmmakers. She concluded that the new wave of Cambodian women cinema that deal with confrontations with low-level perpetrators offer a significant contribution to Cambodian society, as they propose post-genocide ethics ranging from unforgiveness to operatic reconciliation, and advance the possibility of the cinematic creation of ethical communities which can move Cambodian society towards a culture of accountability. Both articles by Durgantoro and Hatley and Marag focus on cultural texts such as theater performances, feature film, and documentary to analyze how women cultural workers in Indonesia and Cambodia engaged with the traumatic events in their respective histories, that is, the 1965 to 66 Anti-Communist Purge in Indonesia and the 1975 to 79 Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia. While the focus of these two works are on artistic strategies, experiential impact, the proposal of post-genocide ethics, and the creation of ethical communities, there is a gap on the exploration of women's experience under genocide, the intergenerational transmission of trauma, and focus on the women's cultural workers behind these women-centric stories. Given these gaps, this study then focuses on the ASEAN women cultural workers and their works that center on women's experience, the relationship between the survivors and their grandchildren, the transmission of intergenerational trauma, and the strategies to restore the ruptured social bonds, that is, the familial and communal relations. Thus, the question that this study aims to answer is, how can ASEAN women cultural workers assist in addressing the negative societal impacts of past political violence on women? This study's objectives are to identify the roles that women cultural workers in the film and theater industry played in helping citizens overcome the trauma caused by military and political conflicts, to assess the strategies they have employed using the medium of film and theater in helping reduce the traumas caused by these conflicts, and to identify the lessons that can be drawn from their works and experiences that may help improve how the ASEAN community can deal with the negative societal impacts of past political violence in post-trauma periods or situations. The research method used for this study is qualitative textual analysis, which, according to McKee, is the central methodology for cultural studies. It involves analyzing the context in which the text is produced or the way in which cultural texts emerge from and play a role in the changing historical, political, and social contexts. For this study, the analysis focuses not just on the cultural texts themselves, but also on their historical, political, and social contexts, especially pertaining to women. The data sources are the two cultural texts, the 2014 play by Faiza Marzueki, The Silent Song of the Gentle Flowers, and the 2014 feature film by Kulikar Sotho, The Last Reel, and interviews with Faiza Marzueki and Kulikar Sotho. The study follows the conceptual framework illustrated here. For the theoretical framework, the study will be drawing from Claudia Card's theory of evil, Marian Hirsch's theory of post-memory generation, and third world feminist theory. Card's theory of evil proposes that evil has two fundamental components: reasonably foreseeable intolerable harm to the victims and culpable wrongdoing by the perpetrators. For Card, genocide is evil because it makes the lives of the victims unbearable, indecent, or impossible, or makes the victims' deaths indecent. Furthermore, Carr proposes that social death is the central evil to genocide as it destroys social vitality, or that which creates identity to life. Social vitality exists in intergenerational and contemporary relationships, and these relationships are what are also destroyed in genocidal events. Thus, survivors of genocide face not only trauma and loss, but also social alienation. In Hirsch's theory of post-memory generation, post-memory is defined as the post-genocide generation's relationship to the traumatic memories that preceded their birth. These memories are then transmuted to either history or myth by the hinged generation through the process of post-memorial work. Post-memorial work is an imaginative reinvestment, projection, and recreation that both reconnects and re-embodies the intergenerational memory fabric severed by the traumatic event. Thus, this embodied living connection acts as a means to address the central evil of genocide, that is, social death. Third world feminism, the development of which is historically intertwined with nationalist and anti-colonial independence movements, has two constitutive ideas and mandates: the situating of the analysis of women's oppression and resistance in historical specificity by paying attention to the local conditions, and recognizing and respecting the historical and political agency of third world women engaged in diverse forms of local activism. Furthermore, third world women's movements tend to focus on enhancing communal conditions, although they inevitably take up causes of gender inequality, even if this was not part of the initial objective. Before we go into the results of this study, let me run through a brief profile of the ASEAN women cultural workers and their works. Faisa Marzueki is an Indonesian playwright, theater producer, and director currently based in Yogyakarta. She is also a feminist and cultural activist who promotes women's liberation and other social issues through creative, cultural, and artistic interventions. Marzueki grew up with a pervasive propaganda that the members of the Gerakan Wanita Indonesia or the Gerwani were perverted, immoral women who tortured and mutilated the army officers before murdering them and throwing their bodies into the well. However, through her activism in women's movements, her own research, and encounter with the surviving Gurwani women and other 1965 women political prisoners, she found for herself the truth behind the pervasive sexual slander. The fact that the survivors were getting older and not getting any recognition, much less justice, for the wrongs committed against them became Marzueki's drive to tell their stories. Her interviews with 30 women survivors and their families, coupled with her extensive research, produced the play The Silent Song of the Gentle Flowers. Hulikar Sotho is a Cambodian filmmaker with extensive experience in filmmaking. Through her work, she was exposed to the story of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge regime and met many of the KR cadre, including Brother Number 2 Nuon Chea, the chief ideologist of the Khmer Rouge, and Brother Number 4 Tamok, also known as the Butcher, a KR senior military leader. Her father died under the Khmer Rouge reign of terror, and her mother, who survived, raised her and her sister. Because of the traumatic experience, her mother did not speak of the past, and this 35-year silence became the impetus for Sotho to make the last reel. The Silent Song of the Ganjar Flowers tells the story of an elderly former Gurwani member, Suhartini, who is tormented over telling her granddaughter Ming about her past. Suhartini invites her friends, who were former political prisoners themselves, although not all were activists, over to give her strength to tell Ming about her past as an activist, her imprisonment, and the horrors she experienced while in prison. Both the Silent Song of the Ganjar Flowers and the Last Reel maximize their respective medium. In the Silent Song of the Ganjar Flowers, Marzowecki maximized the use of the stage by dividing it into three chambers: the past, the present, and soliloquy. There are no hard boundaries among the three, and the characters move from one to the other fluidly. Each area is not necessarily restricted to their designation, and there are frequent overlaps, like when characters musing about the past can do so while being present with what is happening at the moment. This fluidity of movement and overlap, combined with set design of old newspapers papering the walls and the occasional flashing of old photographs in the background, showcase the pervasiveness of the past. Even when the characters are not actively recollecting past events, their actions and reactions are still informed by them. Because of the difficulty of staging a season-long performance, Marzowecki filmed the premiere at the Goethe House and uploaded it in YouTube to reach a wider audience. On the other hand, the last reel employs a metatextual approach and deftly used the missing reel as a metaphor for the lost chapter of Cambodian history. The film was left without an ending, with its future uncertain, much like how the future of Cambodia became uncertain after the genocide. They could not go back to the way things were, or pursue a new ending that ignored the genocide. Thus, Phone's choice to create a new ending that is incongruent with what the story had been so far, but one that acknowledges and accepts the difficult period in their history that had altered their country and its people for good, is revolutionary. It is a wiser, more mature, and nuanced take of what they as a society needs to do to move forward. Also, by depicting the confrontation between victim and perpetrator in the film within the film, the last reel proposes an operatic reconciliation, one that can only be achieved through the medium of film. The story of the Silent Song of the Gentle Flowers is simple and straightforward. There is a loss of familial and communal bonds for the 1965 women political prisoners, regardless if they were actual members of the Gurwani or not. Suhartini was cut off from her daughter Rakma both physically, through incarceration, and socially through the attempt to shield Rakma from the sexual slander against the Gurwani. However, Suhartini's past still came to haunt Rakma, causing her husband, who had loved her before their relation, to leave her, which eventually made her enter into a state of depression that ended in her death. To avert this fate and to connect with her granddaughter in an authentic manner, Suhartini tells Ming the truth of her experiences. In the last reel, the disconnect between the generation that experienced the Khmer Rouge genocide and the generation that came after is highlighted in Sophone's family. Sophone's limited understanding of her mother and her parents' past informs her initial decision to film the proposed ending. When she gained a better understanding of the past, she understands the complex nature of her mother's pain and is able to offer a more mature and nuanced ending. The reconnecting of the past also enables the phone to connect with the future generations, as is shown in the last scene of the film. Regarding the state of women in post-independence Indonesia, rifts widened between the Muslim and secular socialist groups, which reflected the political landscape then. This culminated in the failed putsch of 1965, where afterwards the army spread the propaganda that the Gurwani women tortured, mutilated, and killed the army officers. In contrast to the Gurwani woman is the conservative ideal of womanhood shaped by the values espoused by Suharto's political party, the Golkar. The new order defined women as creatures of the domestic sphere and servants of the family and the state, and did not encourage their political participation. Women were no longer comrades in the revolutionary struggle, but instead were submissive wives and devoted mothers, with Suharto as the super patriarch in his new order society. The two types of womanhood in this period are best exemplified by the two figures in Javanese wayang, the meek and obedient Sumbadra as the new order's model of femininity, and the warrior princess Srikandi as the figure adopted by the Gurwani. In Cambodia, two contrasting types of femininity are portrayed, the traditional conservative type as exemplified by Sraimom, and the modern progressive type exemplified by her daughter Sophon. This traditional and conservative ideal of womanhood can be traced to the centuries-old text that offers a guide to the proper conduct of women, the Chbab Sray. A copy of this book is seen in the film when Sraimom hands it to Sophon to encourage her to behave more like the ideal woman. Under the Khmer Rouge, the core rules of traditional Khmer hierarchy, including the teachings of the Chbab Sray, have been abolished, at least officially. What this means is that the period under the KR regime can be argued as the most gender-equitable period since the pre-classical times in Cambodia, as women were mobilized along men as a workforce for nation-building. However, this superficial construction of equality did not exempt women from being subjugated to specific gendered violence, including a wide variety of rape scenarios and sexual violence, which also included sexual exploitation in forced marriages with cadres. This forced marriage, which was aimed at boosting the then flagging population of Cambodia, is what happened between Bora and Sothea/Sraimom in the last reel. After Sokha's death, Bora married Sothea/Sraimom in a mass marriage ceremony stripped of traditional familiar and spiritual elements, with the intention of saving Sothea/Sraimom from further dangers and death. This is what both Bora and Sraimom keep on repeating to Sophon whenever she criticizes her parents' marriage and their dynamic, which had seen her mother quietly submitting to Bora even when he was violent. Even today in Indonesia, the Gurwani women are still viewed as depraved and immoral women. The effect of this can be seen in the play when Rahma's adopted mother tried to shield Rahma from the sexual slander by severing her ties with Suhartini. And yet, when Rahma's husband found out that her mother was a political prisoner, he shunned her, which led to her depression and eventual death. Ming also expresses her confusion as to why people still said that women like her grandmother used to dance around naked, referring to the army propaganda that stated that the Gurwani women danced naked and participated in orgies while they were torturing the army officials. Even up until now, there has been no retraction of this account, even when this has already been disproven by the autopsies. Suhartini and her friends continue to bear the sexual slander. In Cambodia, there was a reassertion of tradition, including the codified codes of conduct, to reconstruct the Khmer nation after the ousting of the Khmer Rouge from power. However, the KR institution of forced marriage and the state-enforced culture of violence against women have worsened the domestic and sexual violence already condoned by tradition. Despite the ousting of the Khmer Rouge regime, its legacy has seeped into almost every aspect of contemporary Cambodian society. In the film, the relationship between Bora and Sothea/Sraimom bears the obvious marks of this legacy. She submissively takes her husband's rages and stands up for him despite his violence. not only because of the Chababsray code of conduct, but also out of gratitude to him for saving her life. The last one takes primacy over the ethical complications of his role as a KR cadre responsible for the enforcement of the inhumane rules of the regime and for the murder of his fellow Cambodians, not including the fact that he also murdered the only man his wife had ever loved, since this detail is kept secret from her. The KR legacy of forced marriage can also be seen in Barr's insistence on replicating the arranged marriage dynamic, that is, matching up his daughter with a military man or a son of a military man. As cultural workers, Faisa Marzoueki and Kulikar Sotho maximize their chosen medium in presenting the counter-narratives that are rooted in women's experience of the traumatic events and their lingering effects. The role of cultural workers is important as the cultural texts that they create are informed by and inform the changing historical, political, and social contexts of their respective societies. Thus, works by women, for women, and about women are especially important as they capture a specific type of experience in post-genocide Southeast Asian context that is often overlooked. Marzoueki and Soto, through their works, perform the process of what Hirsch calls the imaginative investment, projection, and creation to actively engage with the past, which then embody these with living connections, encountering the loss of communal and social bonds resulting from the traumatic historic events in their respective societies. As a result, Marzoueki and Soto simultaneously reclaim space for women in the historical narrative of events and aid in the restoration of the social, communal, and intergenerational connections ruptured by these traumatic events. Faiza Marzoueki's attempts to preserve the memories of the Gurwani and pass them on to the younger generation is an act of defiance against the destruction of collective memory of the Gurwani women, which decades of slander and silence have facilitated. By mediating these confrontations with low-level perpetrators through imaginative fictional portrayals, Kulikar Sotho is able to facilitate in expressing the complex emotions that come with the victims and perpetrators living side by side, sometimes within the same family. Sotho shared that the trauma that the generation before her experienced from the genocide overshadowed their lives and those of the next generation. Recognizing that Cambodian society is currently trapped emotionally due to the complex legacy of the civil war and the genocide, Sotha wanted to express through the film the need to reconcile so they could move on. Post-memorial work concerns the dynamic intergenerational transmission of trauma, that is, a generation-specific response to a traumatic historic event that seeks to represent the experience of the directly affected generation in new ways. Through the process of imaginative investment projection and creation, post-memorial work embodies a living connection to the past as well as intergenerational horizontal contemporaneous identification, thus counteracting the loss of social vitality that exists through contemporary and intergenerational bonds, which is the central evil of genocide. The image of the lost mother and the fantasy of her recovery is a very potent trope in mobilizing the work of post-memory. This trope can be noted in the two works by Marzoueki and Sotho. In the silent song of the Ganjar flowers, the loss of the mother is literal, Rakma's death and Suhartini's estrangement, and in the last reel, the loss is symbolic, Surimom's traumatized state. The impetus for the recovery of the lost maternal connection comes from different directions in the two works, from the grandmother to the granddaughter in the silent song of the Ganjar flowers, and from the daughter to the mother in the last reel. In both accounts, the connection is recovered by learning what the grandmother/mother went through. While each centered on one family and can thus be construed as individual stories, it should be noted that individual memories include more than what the individual per se experience. Rather, with individuals as part of social groups, these memories, especially once verbalized, then become part of the collective memory. Thus, the intimacy of the family stories can gain a wider collective significance, and thus can become an effective strategy in addressing certain negative societal impacts of traumatic historic events. However, it is not enough to simply relay the painful and traumatic experiences of the victims of the genocide. They also need to empower them, in the sense that they are also portrayed beyond their victimhood. In the silent song of the Ganjar flowers, the women survivors share with Ming their days as activists during the early years of Indonesia's independence. They talk about their past with pride, the social activities they did together with the other young people with the aim of uplifting the communal living standards. In the last reel, Sophone gets a glimpse of Cambodia's glorious past before the Civil War through the film within the film The Long Way Home. Here, Sotha's familiarity with the classical aesthetics due to her background as a classical dancer helped imbue the film within the film with the golden era looks and energy. With the multifaceted portrayal of the victims, Marzueki and Sotha facilitate in restoring their dignity. This is a key aspect of post-memorial work that does not seek to re-traumatize but to counter the ruptures caused by traumatic historic events through the embodiment of living connection. Marzueki and Sotha employed the post-memorial strategy of imaginative storytelling to address the negative societal impacts in post-traumatic societies through fictional conversations and encounters that may be too difficult to do in real life. These include the receptiveness to hearing about the truth behind the slander against the Gurwani women in the silent song of the Genji flowers, and the confrontations between victims and perpetrators in the last reel. While there are significant changes in their approach as warranted by their specific historical and national contexts, both ASEAN women cultural workers exhibited critical and conscientious examination of the possibilities of reparation, reconciliation, and reconnection. The endings of the two works are grounded in the material realities of the current state of Indonesian and Cambodian societies, even in the optimistic ending note in the last reel. There is a self-awareness on the limitations of these cultural texts in proposing the way forward. The ethical implications of having women survivors retell their traumatic stories in The Silent Song of the Genji Flowers, and the complex post-genocidal ethics in the last reel. While these two works do not seek to provide cathartic relief, they instead aspire to provide something more significant, the necessary historical truth. To conclude, let us go back to the objectives of this study. To identify the roles that women cultural workers play in helping citizens overcome the trauma caused by military and political conflicts, to assess the strategies they have employed using the medium of film and theater in helping reduce the traumas caused by these conflicts, and to identify the lessons that can be drawn from their works and experiences that may help improve how the ASEAN community can deal with the negative societal impacts of past political violence in post-trauma periods and situations. First objective, which is to identify the roles that ASEAN women cultural workers play to help their communities overcome the trauma caused by military and political conflicts, we have Faisa Marzueki and Kulikar Sotho preserving the memories of the slandered and silenced women directly affected by the genocide and facilitated the expressing of complex emotions of living in a post-genocide society through cinematically mediated confrontations between perpetrators and victims. Second, for the assessment of the strategies they used in helping reduce trauma caused by conflicts, both Marzueki and Sotho employed post-memorial strategy of imaginative storytelling using the potent trope of the lost mother and the fantasy of her recovery to imbue their works with a living connection to the past and to restore the ruptured social bonds. Lastly, to identify the lessons that can be drawn from their works and experiences that may help improve how the ASEAN community can deal with the negative societal impacts of past political violence in post-trauma periods and situations. This study concludes that the post-memorial work by ASEAN women cultural workers can be an effective strategy in exploring the possibility of restoration of the ruptured social bonds, both intergenerational and contemporary, and reclaiming space for women and their experiences during and after a genocidal event. However, there is a need to situate these works in their specific historical or national context for them to be effective and meaningful. Post-memorial feminist strategies that are grounded on the unique historical and social context of their respective society, such as those employed by Faiza Marzueki and Kulikar Sotho, can be an important resource for ASEAN cultural workers seeking to engage with the subject of women's experience under genocide and of restoring the ruptured social bonds. To end my presentation, I would like to quote the two ASEAN women cultural workers chosen for this study. For Faiza Marzueki, the intergenerational trauma must be truly thought of and healed as a collective struggle, a struggle for solidarity, in various ways, including works of art. It's the task of art and humanity, the task of humanity in art. For Kulikar Sotho, we all need to understand our past in order to make sense of the present day and the future. We need to know where we came from to know who we are. and therefore where to go. Our region's history of mass killings and atrocities may be very painful to look back and examine, but it is in learning about these events and in acknowledging and trying to understand them, especially from the perspective of the victims of the marginalized, that we may begin to find a way towards healing and reconciliation. Thank you for listening. That is all for my presentation today.